So again, greetings everyone. I'm here talking to Fernand de Varennessel, Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues of the United Nations. And our topic will concern a proposal for a draft global convention on the rights of minorities that he presented as part of his last thematic report submitted to the UN Human Rights Council this March. Now, this draft proposal was elaborated with the involvement of various minority rights experts, and it is meant to be a source of inspiration for UN office holders to initiate a process that could ultimately lead to the adoption of a legally binding instrument on this subject. Many thanks, Mr. de Varennessel, for accepting my invitation for this interview. Welcome. And let's cut to the chase, I suggest, if you agree.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me.
Okay. So in your last thematic report as Special Rapporteur, you concurred with Secretary General Antonio Guterres that there are not simply gaps in the minority protection system of the UN, but, quote, outright inaction and negligence. You also added that there had been little or no significant development institutionally at the United Nations to advance the protection of minorities when compared with other marginalized groups. And you also mentioned specifically that this means no treaty, no permanent forum, no voluntary fund, no international decade or year, no mainstreaming of their human rights, and no or little reference to them in UN documents. So with all these in mind, if you look back on your 6 years as Special Rapporteur, what are the areas where you actually saw some improvements?
Well, thank you very much for that. In fact, you summarized my report much better than I could have done, I think. Let me just say the only area at the United Nations level that I think we can say that there has been improvement is in the establishment of a network on minorities and discrimination within the UN. So the United Nations did reinstate or resuscitate a network that used to exist, then became moribund for a number of years, and a few years ago was reactivated in a sense. Now, this is it's important, but it's only internal. It's an internal United Nations periodic meeting of different departments to talk about minority and discrimination issues. But beyond that, there really is nothing to report except under my own mandate. We launched a number of years ago, as you know, in 2019, is regional forums on minority issues in different parts, different regions of the world. And that really is on the ground the only significant initiative taking up at the United Nations level to deal with the rights of minorities. And even that, the regional forums, is actually a creation of my mandate, under my mandate. I have no idea if this will be continued because it's not been formally adopted, officially adopted by the United Nations itself.
Yes, indeed, that's what I wanted to ask. It pretty much hangs in the balance whether or not your successor will continue with the regional forums.
Yes, exactly. My mandate is coming soon to an end. The regional forums, which are important because, especially outside of Europe, it gives a chance for minority representatives and voices to meet and talk and present their challenges, the issues they face. And in areas such as Africa and Asia, for example, this is extremely important because there really is not any mechanism for them, any initiative. But it depends on the next special rapporteur. The UN, the Human Rights Council, has referred to the regional forums in the resolution as something good, but there's no financial support or formal approval yet from the UN institutions that would ensure the continuation of the regional forum. So we'll have to see what happens with the next special rapporteur. and whether the UN will take up this initiative as perhaps one of the only ones really in the last few decades.
I see. Okay, so if you could perhaps let's talk a bit about the procedure itself. So I was wondering, how did you select the experts who took part in elaborating the text of the draft Global Convention? What are your expectations or your hopes on how this draft should or could go through the UN's decision-making process? And how will it be possible to get the opinion of minority organizations on this draft? So if you could just inform us about these procedural aspects.
Yeah, the experts who were invited to contribute to the drafting of the proposed treaty on the rights of minorities were identified mainly on the basis of their previous participation in the regional forums on minority issues, where we had expert panels, or the UN Forum on Minority Issues in Geneva. So we actually had a significant pool, if you will, of experts from different regions of the world based on these activities that we had. And from there, we approached a number of them asking if they would contribute to preparing this proposal. And I think everyone did, as a matter of fact. So that was the way that we approached the process in terms of the drafting a global draft report, proposed global treaty on the rights of minorities. Just to add perhaps another element, it's important to remember that when we talk about what are the rights of minorities at the UN level, we're not only talking about national minorities, which is more the European focus. We talk about national or ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities, which is
I will come back to the terminology. That's certainly an important question.
It is an important aspect. It's a much wider category. So we had to have individuals who identify perhaps more as religious or involved in religious minorities, the linguistic minorities, and other categories. What were the other two questions? I'm sorry.
So how do you expect this to go through the UN decision-making process?
It was important to launch the idea. In other words, to start talking about that. All of this fits within the anniversary of the 30th anniversary of the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Minorities. It was one of my thematic areas of reports also, that we looked at what has been accomplished since the adoption 30 years ago of the UN Declaration and what needs to be improved. So from all of that, it came very clear that the UN, quite frankly, has done very, very, very little in relation to the rights of minorities in terms of the institutions of the UN, the different mechanisms to address minority issues. And so therefore, having highlighted, if you will, this negligence, as the UN Secretary General himself admitted, this negligence by the United Nations, and noted how things have improved for many other marginalized groups, such as indigenous peoples, children, migrants, people of African descent, etc., etc. And nothing has happened really for minorities. Now that it's all out and formally, officially recommended by my mandate, it is hoped that the Human Rights Council may take it up, or the OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, might consider this an area where they have to prepare files, if you will, a dossier, so that either the Human Rights Council or the UN General Assembly can start looking and perhaps working on it. Now, this is complex. It is a state, having a treaty is a state-led initiative. The UN, in a sense, provides the institutional support, but you need governments, national governments, who are willing to move this on the agenda so that there is a formal resolution or approach adopted, either at the Human Rights Council, more usually at the UN General Assembly.
Okay, and I think as far as the third question goes, how to get the feedback of minorities, the regional forums will be a pretty good platform for that.
Pretty good platform, but a second main recommendation that I made at the last report, which you mentioned, is that minorities need a much better platform at the United Nations. Groups such as indigenous peoples, peoples of African descent, they have what are called the UN permanent forums. Permanent forums is essentially representatives of people of African descent or indigenous people have a platform, a forum, which lasts 3-4 weeks even, usually at the UN General Assembly in New York, where they can lobby the UN, where they can actually present their cases, where they have a huge amount of visibility and presence and ability to change, in fact, and to work with government, state delegations, and change the agenda at the United Nations. This is what I think is absolutely also a necessity. If you have a permanent forum, it's much more feasible for minorities to participate. Usually there's financial assistance to have minorities participate in these forums, representatives participate, and that they can actually lobby, influence the United Nations to perhaps move more towards a treaty or other type of mechanism. So I would suggest to you that this is also one of the directions that are needed. The treaty is an ultimate objective, and I think it is necessary, but also minorities need a much more solid platform that is financially and institutionally supported by the United Nations to give them a visibility and that they are audible. And this calls for a permanent forum, which actually in a way is easier to create than a treaty. So that's one of the other areas which I think are essential for us to move ahead, because we have not moved ahead for decades when it comes to the protection of minorities at the United Nations.
Right. All right. That's pretty clear. You mentioned the terminology that's been used. I was also wondering a bit about that because so the draft proposal itself does not contain a description of what constitutes a minority. That can only be found in one of the optional protocols, which is already, I believe, an interesting circumstance. Furthermore, it does not mention at all the right to self-determination, which, however, is considered to be a key concept in the advocacy of many minority organizations, especially internal self-determination. And additionally, the text contains certain terms that are not used in Europe. But as you mentioned, I assume that it was an objective to kind of surpass this Europe-centric minority protection system. But Article 19, for example, speaks of, quote, isolated, nomadic, semi-nomadic, and seafaring minorities, which is not something that is normally used in Europe. So what was the rationale or the guiding principle in the use of the terminology?
Very good points. I would add a few nuances, even though we don't offer a specific definition of minority. There is because the treaty, the proposed draft treaty, actually has a second part. And in the second part, we elaborate a bit more on what is a linguistic minority and an ethnic minority and a religious minority. So in a way, without being a definition, it helps us understand what are meant by these different categories of minorities within the UN system. So there's a bit more clarity there, which without being a specific and unique definition actually does provide, I think, clear indications of what are meant by these different categories of minorities at the UN system. Number one. Number two, that connects to your second point. There is no right of self-determination, but it is suggested that in relation to, there is a form of autonomy. Some of the provisions in a way recommend forms of autonomy. I forget the exact wording. And that goes a long way towards what could be considered to be forms of internal self-determination. At the time, and I'll be very honest, at the time of the consultation with the experts on drafting this proposal, many experts were not comfortable with using the word self-determination. And so there was a compromise made, as there is often in politics, to not use that word, but that in some of the content we are actually, we have the content of internal self-determination, but perhaps using words that are slightly different. Not everyone might agree with that, but that was, excuse me, that was the approach. that was ultimately chosen. We'll see what will happen if there is a mechanism to start drafting a new treaty at the UN. They may approach it differently. Thirdly, as to the different concepts, I think it's important to realize that we are talking about a global treaty and not a European instrument. European instruments tend to focus almost exclusively on national minorities. At the UN level, we actually don't. Usually, not always, but usually, we refer to ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities. So one has to understand that at the United Nations level, the concept of minorities is probably, no, I would say very clearly, much more expansive than the concept at the European level. And this is a UN proposal. It's not a European one. So it had to go into areas which, for example, would not necessarily happen. So if I can just add one element, when we talk about minorities at the UN, it does mean that certain groups, such as nomadic groups, could clearly be a minority, an ethnic minority, for example, under UN instruments. It's not so clear that under the European concept of national minority, whether they would be included or not. Us at the international level, it's very clear that they could, and they would be included as an ethnic minority, for example.
You mentioned autonomy, and certainly that is a point that I wanted to touch upon, because that's probably one of the very interesting and intriguing parts of the draft. It's Article 20. Actually, I would be inclined to quote it. Article 20 of the draft says, in the regions or territories in which significant numbers of a minority reside or are in a majority, minorities shall be entitled in particular to the enjoyment of and empowered through appropriate forms of autonomy or self-governance. Now, I would argue, and I'm curious to see whether you agree with me on this point or not. So I would argue that if you have a minority community that is geographically concentrated in a specific area, then you cannot produce a truly inclusive and effective decision-making system if you do not address the territorial dimension of the issue. So in this particular case, I would argue that the minimum standard should be to have an administrative structure that takes into account the cultural and the linguistic circumstances. That doesn't happen in many countries. We could mention Slovakia or France, for example. Alsace doesn't even appear on the map of France. But if we go further, then more preferably some form of territorial autonomy might be recommended, or even moving towards a more asymmetric regionalism, such as the one existing in Italy, or perhaps even the federalization of a country, like in the case of Belgium. So I'm not sure if you would agree with me on that.
Short answer is yes, I would agree with you on that. The longer answer is, of course, the provision which you quoted earlier is a rather general one. In order to be able to accommodate extremely different contexts, obviously, in different parts of the world. So it doesn't actually say that there's only a territorial autonomy which would be suitable, but it does suggest there must be something in place. And in some parts of the world, territorial autonomy may not be realistic or possible to implement for various reasons. And so that provision opens the door to issues of autonomy without actually saying that there can only be one approach of territorial autonomy that would be suitable for extremely different contexts, such as in Africa or in Asia. So, but generally speaking, and I think there are many good examples, which you in fact pointed out to, the territorial autonomy approach seems to have been very successful in places like Sud Tirol, Alto Adige in Italy, and other parts of the world including Belgium, the federal model, and others. And therefore, this is not something that government should be scared of. Quite the opposite. The territorial autonomy has actually worked quite well, where it is implemented in a way that reflects the reality on the ground of groups of people that are concentrated and share the same language, identity, culture, and over a certain territory. So I think that is one of the aspects, Article 20, I think it was, which is a significant suggestion, actually. That goes pretty far in terms of a legal instrument. We'll see in the future if it's something that governments are willing to consider, but I think it is quite an innovative and important step forward that it's actually contained in the treaty, proposed treaty, even though we did not talk about internal self-determination.
Yeah, indeed. All right, another section that I think was very important, and I would probably even call it progressive, is part 5, which deals with the redistribution or the protection of resources of those particular lands where minorities reside. So Article 29 stipulates, and again I quote, "Minorities shall exercise the right individually and collectively to the protection and exploitation of the resources found on their traditional land, and shall exercise the right to freely dispose of or utilize their natural wealth and resources." And this provision, of course, comes with the essential requirement that state parties should take effective measures to prevent the expropriation and exploitation of such lands and natural resources. Now, these provisions appear to me that they resemble those stipulated in the Convention number 169 of the International Labour Organization. So I was wondering, is it accurate to characterize this specific part of the draft as an attempt to close the gap between indigenous peoples' rights and those of national, ethnic, or linguistic minorities?
It's a very good observation, but I would turn that around a little bit. In many parts of the world, you have minorities who are also at the same time indigenous peoples. And this is where we have to be clear that one category does not necessarily exclude the other. The Sami in the Nordic countries, for example, are indigenous peoples. They're widely recognized as such, but they're also considered to be national minorities under the Framework Convention for the protection of national minorities. So I think one has to, keeping that in mind, in the past, perhaps the economic aspect was omitted in acknowledging or recognizing the rights of minorities and other groups. The recognition of the importance of control of the economy and of resources, I think, was a later development at the UN and other regional institutions. And it is something that has progressed a great deal with indigenous peoples, but something also that minorities, that are important for minorities in different parts of the world. There are many concrete examples where minorities, especially national minorities, traditionally inhabiting a territory in a country and having control over the resources there. There are many examples of minorities having their land expropriated, their property expropriated even, or access to certain resources, either fishing or others, forestry, being limited. And so it is rather innovative. It is inspired by some of the progress made in relation to indigenous peoples, but it is an important standalone right for minorities, because it does happen that unfortunately some governments omit the economic aspect, the importance of resources, of property and economic activities of minorities, and these be protected as such, recognized and protected. I know that the OSCE and the High Commissioner on National Minorities is just recently this year coming out with similar recommendations, by the way. Mm-hmm. So we are actually progressing in a direction which I think others are acknowledging as important for minorities, and particularly national minorities. because they tend to be victims of discrimination in relation to those particular economic and resource aspects.
Indeed. But what's important here is that this will be a general right for minorities, whereas if minority communities were able to achieve these kind of protection, it was usually on an ad hoc basis in the framework of certain autonomy arrangements, like, for example, the Åland Islands.
Yeah.
So this is why this will be particularly important. Another issue that will be a novelty is the establishment of the Committee on Minority Rights. So there are two optional protocols of this draft convention, and according to the first, this minority convention would pretty much resemble other UN treaty bodies. It would have a monitoring and complaint mechanism under the auspices of this newly established Committee of Minority Rights. And this would be the body to which state parties would submit their reports every 4 years on how they implemented the convention. And most interestingly, this would also be the body that would deal with the individual complaints or communications of individuals who claim that the rights enumerated in the convention have been violated. Now, this is certainly a point that many member states will feel particularly uncomfortable with, especially those where political elites tend to securitize minority issues or believe that implementing minority rights might fuel conflict. So it's better to suppress minority identities and limit their participation in international fora, hoping that their voice will eventually fade away. So I was wondering, how would this mechanism function in practice, in your opinion? And most importantly, how would you argue in favor of establishing such a body for state officials who in their domestic politics tend to be hostile or at least suspicious towards the internationalization of minority aspirations?
A lot of very good questions there. I think the main thing is to highlight to recalcitrant states that this proposed treaty is actually, it includes good practices, that conflicts, for example, are not fueled by the existence of minorities as such, but where you actually let grievances and exclusion drag on for years of minorities, that is what fuels discontent, that raises, in some cases, anger, frustration, and eventually violence, perhaps even. And so therefore, in order to avoid conflicts, in order to achieve justice, equal and equality for everyone, these are the practices that you should be implementing in your own country. This treaty is actually the pathway to peace and stability for states. And that's really the objective of international human rights generally. But in the case of minorities, I think it's particularly relevant. So I would turn around the fear of conflicts and use it to say exactly, if you want to avoid conflicts, then this is the pathway. These are the practices that actually work. And we have plenty of examples, such as Åland Islands that you mentioned, South Tyrol, and others. And so I think it won't be an easy sell. There are some governments who will never be convinced. But there's nothing revolutionary in having the guidelines, if you will, on what to do to treat minorities well. If you want to treat minorities well, here are the good practices based on human rights standards that would work in this area. Now, we have many treaties, human rights treaties at the United Nations, which have similar type of committees, as you pointed out. States, you cannot force a state to ratify any treaty. And so therefore it is for the United Nations also to, if a proposal is put forward, to actually work in convincing states that they should ratify these treaties, accept these treaties, and the mechanism, the supervision mechanism under them, and the complaint mechanism under them. It's been done for other areas. As you know, there are many other treaties now at the United Nations level. Certainly, many governments will not want to do it initially, but there are quite a few governments who are not afraid of rights for minorities and who would be willing to go in this direction, in my view. So that's the way that this can be approached. Once again, being optimistic, but also hoping that governments can be convinced that the pathways to peace means justice for all, and that means treating minorities well. And here are examples of what to do based on practices in a number of countries around the world.
All right. So another question we just touched upon, the internationalization of minority aspirations. Another constantly debated issue is language. Now, I actually checked, and the word language is the one that occurs most often in the draft proposal, 95 times actually, to be exact.
I did not know that.
And so I was wondering, was this because there are so many different contentious issues attached to the linguistic dimension, or because you thought that the use and teaching of minority languages is the most pervasive and widespread problem when it comes to protecting minorities?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both actually. And I would add also, language is perhaps one of the important characteristics, components of identity for many minorities around the world that has been perhaps neglected most at the United Nations. And even in Europe, I mean, there is a charter for regional or minority languages, but it is, as you know, a weak document because it's not enforceable directly. Individuals cannot make claims of rights under that treaty. And so I think because of this omission, this neglect at the international level, the importance of language in the identity of individuals and communities, and thirdly, the centrality of language in education for linguistic minorities, that we had to compensate, in a sense, to provide greater clarity in direction in an area that has probably been insufficiently dealt with by the certainly UN institutions up to now.
All right. We are coming to the end of the discussion. I want two more things that I would like to ask you about. First is the current international order, the changing international order, should I add. As you mentioned in the thematic report, the early 90s proved to be a period that led to the adoption of global and regional instruments and treaties such as the Council of Europe's Framework Convention and the Language Charter. However, for such developments, the international community needed large-scale changes, such as the disintegration of the Soviet Union, an upsurge in violent conflicts in different parts of the world, and most notably for us in Europe, the Yugoslav wars. So I was wondering if, in your opinion, can the war in Ukraine provide a similar incentive for the international community to adopt this draft convention on minorities, insofar as Russia started its invasion using a totally unsubstantiated claim pertaining to the treatment of the Russian minority in Eastern Ukraine?
And thank you, I think that's a very important question, and it's actually very perceptive. If the international community wants to avoid the instrumentalization of minority rights claims or issues, then it has to provide greater clarity as what are the rights of minorities and the standards that have to be respected. I think it's easier when you have gaps, when you have omissions. And certainly that's what we have at the global level at the United Nations. It's unclear, well, what are the rights of minorities? So, and outside interference is actually easier to do because of this this lack of clarity and precision in what ought to be in place. I would say that we are, in fact, not exactly like in the 1990s, but we are in a period where there is an upsurge in violent conflicts around the world. If you look at statistics, in fact, we have more conflicts now than we've had in the last 3 decades. Most of these are internal conflicts. And even in the case of the Ukraine, which is not an internal conflict, it's an international one, you have a minority dimension that is in place. Most internal conflicts, not all of them, but most, also have a minority dimension. And therefore, and there's not only that, we are seeing a huge upsurge also in hate speech and social media and scapegoating, and in fact, incitement to genocide against minorities around the world. And on quite a significant number of other markers, if you will, we have entered a period where minorities are probably, their rights are being denied even more today than it was 20 years ago. Education, for example, in minority languages is increasingly being restricted, even prohibited in a number of countries. We're seeing it, in fact, in countries like Latvia, which has become public. We heard it being alleged in Ukraine. I've raised it in relation to the Tibetan minority in China. So what we are seeing is a context where perhaps because the situation seems so dark and desperate for many minorities, maybe this is the proper time to start talking, what can we do to deal with these upsurge in conflicts involving minorities and the instrumentalization of minority issues for war? What can we do to address hate speech and calls to violence and even genocide targeting minorities more, and so on? So I think perhaps the context is appropriate, is needed. This is the time where we need minorities, minority protection, because the situation seems so dire and dark.
All right. My last question is rather maybe a psychological one. So I'm, apart from being a social scientist, I'm also engaged in minority rights advocacy myself. And I know for a fact that many colleagues are despondent and disillusioned when it comes to the effectiveness of international advocacy. So as a closing remark, what would you say to them? Do you see a silver lining on the horizon when it comes to minority rights advocacy?
Think of minority rights as an unfinished story. There was significant progress made in the 1990s when, for example, the Framework Convention on the Protection of National Minorities, the European Charter for Regional Minority Languages was adopted, and the UN Declaration was also approved. But all of that were only the first steps. And I think we need to be honest. And honesty means that we have to acknowledge that the instruments that we thought were sufficient are not. We made a great deal of progress, but you will know that the Framework Convention, for example, on the protection of national minorities is not directly an enforceable treaty. It's not a real treaty. Well, it is a treaty, but it's a framework, which means in theory, in most countries, you cannot apply it directly in the legal system of your state, of your country. There are some exceptions. The Germans say you can do it, but the European Charter, for example, very clear. It creates absolutely no rights. I think a lot of people were naive. They thought, oh, well, we don't really need a treaty. A framework convention will be enough. The European Charter, you can't directly enforce it legally, but that will be enough. It's not enough. The UN Declaration is not a treaty. It was created in a context where we recognize more needed to be done, and I think we need to recognize this. There was a great deal of progress made in the 1990s, but now we have to finish the job, because the job was never completely finished. The Framework Convention is only a framework. The European Charter is not legally binding as such, or does not create rights, I should say, in terms of the law. The UN Declaration is only a declaration. It worked, kind of worked initially. It's insufficient. More has to be done to actually ensure proper protection of minorities. And that means further development. I think in Europe, if I may make this personal observation, you need a legally binding document that individuals can raise even in their courts of law. The Framework Convention is not that. You have the European Convention of Human Rights, which you can actually apply directly, not the documents for minorities. And that is a failure. That is a weakness. That if we should not be despondent. There was a lot of good work done in the 1990s, but it was never enough. And now we have to be realistic, acknowledge the limits, and try to move it further, quite frankly.
All right. I believe that is a perfect way to end this conversation. Mr. de Varenne, this concludes our discussion for today. Many thanks again for accepting this invitation. And I believe I speak also for my colleagues when I say that we hope to see you continuing your work for the human rights of minorities.
Thank you very much for that wish. I hope I can contribute in some way, because the time has come to do more, to do better, and to do what is needed to better protect and